everyone. Welcome to a new episode of Contours, the Cambridge Literary Studies Hour. My name is Quayson, and I am professor and chair of the English department at Stanford University. I will be the host of each episode. Each episode of Contours will address a pressing issue, theme, or concept in 21st century literary studies. In many of these episodes, I will be hosting a dialogue with an author or authors from the Cambridge University press list. Others will feature a panel of experts in the field, and I will introduce that episode. We aim to provide an invigorating, accessible forum for critical debate and reflection to engage and help students, teachers, and general readers. Contours will range from medieval literature to the present day, from all areas of global literary studies in the northern and southern hemispheres. Each episode will be approximately an hour long and will be available via YouTube on our Contours page on Cambridge Core. In today's episode, it is my greatest pleasure to have with me Kent Puckett, with whom I'm going to have a chat about his book, The Electoral Imagination, recently published by Cambridge University Press. We hope you find this episode of Contours, the Cambridge Literary Studies Hour, useful, enjoyable, and relevant. And more importantly, that you are encouraged to join us again in the next edition. Thank you very much. And now to Kent. I was reading your book, which is extraordinarily fascinating, which I think will be of great interest to both political theorists and literary scholars. But I wanted to ask you, what got you to write this book? Give us a bit of the biography of your book, of the Electoral Imagination.
Yes. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. This is a real pleasure. So I started this book a long time ago, which is an important and, at least to me, interesting part of its development. Years ago now, I was participating in a conference on the novel and democracy, and I decided, sort of on a lark, that I wanted to write about Lewis Carroll. And simply, I didn't know anything about the topic, but I always wondered why there was a caucus race in Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. What's this political event doing there? And so as I began to think more about it and to do some research, where I expected it to be, a paper that would be a kind of reflection on the kind of more ambient relationship between politics and literature, I discovered that there was a much deeper connection, and that Lewis Carroll was not only an author of incredibly beautiful children's books, not only a mathematician, but an important theorist of elections and an important theorist of making decisions on committees and with other people, and that the relevance of his work as a theorist of social choice has been enormously important. And so as I started thinking about this more than ambient connection, but that there was a deep relationship between democratic processes, how do you make decisions? How do you aggregate the preferences, the beliefs, the desires of many individuals into the preference of the group? That this was not only an essential part of his work, but that it popped up in Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and through The Looking Glass in all kinds of really, really interesting ways. One of the ways that I became especially interested in, and it's something that I talk about a lot in The Electoral Imagination, is how Carroll had independently discovered or rediscovered what's called Condorcet's paradox, which is a tendency of elections, particularly ranked choice elections, to sometimes collapse into a kind of paradoxical cycle. And it had a very Lewis Carroll feel, right? The fact that when you add up a set of preferences, a group could prefer choice A over B, B over C, and C over A. You get into a loop that never ends, right? Very much, a kind of Wonderlandian thing. So, as I began to think about that figure of the loop, a loop, and this is something that has come up in political science and electoral theory many times over the years, I became interested, on the one hand, in the kind of aesthetic qualities of this loop, the fact that there was something, to me anyway, both troubling and oddly beautiful about it. And on the other hand, to think about the intellectual or even the imaginative history of some of these ideas that have circulated in electoral theory. So that's where I started, trying to think about this meeting place of the political, the aesthetic, the literary, the social, and the imaginative in pretty general terms. Of course, as I did more work, and it took me a long time, my writing moved out over into the last few years, when people have been thinking more and more, and in more and more anxious, immediate, and urgent ways about how elections are conducted and what they mean. So it was a peculiar thing, because this was a kind of playful project for me in the beginning that became more and more consequential as historical events unfolded around me. So the book remains what it started as, which is an attempt to think about the imaginative intersection of politics and literature, right? Or, as I put in the title, literature and legitimacy. But it's also a book that had to learn, as I wrote it, how to respond to the political present. I couldn't just leave it out. I couldn't leave the variety of recounts, the variety of challenges to the electoral system, which we've all lived through over the last 5 or 6 years. I couldn't just see that on the outside. So the process of writing the book has really been about maintaining my core commitment to this question about a relationship between politics and aesthetics as it plays out in the practical business of designing and conducting elections, on the one hand, and also sort of negotiating that interest in relation to events as they continue to unfold. My book was done, and I was sort of looking at it with one eye and then watching the midterm elections with the other, and feeling my book's significance changing with every reported vote. So it's been a really interesting process for me, especially as someone who has spent much of his career writing about the past and writing about people who are mostly dead. These are very living issues that I've written about, and that's been a really striking thing for me.
So one of the things that I want to ask a question which has two parts. And one is from the beginning, and one is from the middle, because you talk a lot about rigging, rigging, but rigging as almost, it has real consequences and so on, but almost as a rhetorical structure, whose effects are to undermine not just the belief in elections or electoral processes, but belief in other things as well. So that's one part of the question. The second part is something that, and I'm trying to see if I can quote it from the book. And this is your description, and you pause several times to describe what you're doing, to signpost what you're doing. And this is one of the signposts. It might make more sense to approach what used to be called the history of ideas in terms that we tend to reserve for the more palpable textures of material culture. That is, ideas as things.
Yes.
And you have a whole section on the hanging chad.
Yes.
So it's a thing, and all of a sudden people become obsessed with this thing, the thingness. So the two parts of the question then are the rigging as a rhetorical kind of, not so much ploy, but an infrastructure. and the ideas behind elections, which get, as it were, expressed or captured in the things, ballot boxes and charts and machines. And once people begin to suspect or lose confidence in the things themselves, the whole edifice becomes, so those are the things, if you could comment.
Yeah, thank you so much. So the first part, rigging. Yeah, rigging is that was one of the places where, as the work developed, and I tried to find that link between some of the theoretical, some of the aesthetic ideas that I was working with, and the present. Rigging was really a hinge for me, and in part because the word, and this is really where the book starts, the word has become this this thing that gets repeated again and again, right? And it's emerged as a kind of, I don't know, you call it a trope, you could recall, I mean, however you want to think about it, this phrase, the rigged system. And it's one that, as it gets used more and more, it's less and less clear what exactly it means. And so one of the things that I was interested in, particularly at the outset of the book, is to think about some different ways of understanding what logically, rhetorically, semantically is happening with the concept of rigging. And I sort of lay it out in two sections. On the one hand, I'm interested in what I call the myth of rigging, which is really a kind of multi-staged process where different aspects, right, of this concept of rigging, I separate them out in order to show how it's the confusion between these different aspects that legitimates a lot of claims, and more to the point, a lot of the actions that are taken as a result of having made the claim that an election is rigged, right? So one of the things that I do is lay out three different senses, three different aspects of the myth of rigging. One aspect is the idea that when we say an election is rigged, we're simply referring to the fact that things go wrong, right? I mean, elections are big, they're complicated, there are a lot of parts, a lot of people, things will always go wrong, right? And so that sense that there's something wrong and that exposes the made or the manufactured, the constructed quality of an election, right? This is one of the ways in which rigging is invoked. Another way that rigging is invoked, though, is as a kind of larger plot or plan, right? That they have decided to steal the election, right? Whoever they are, right? So this sense of a kind of looming conspiracy. And that, in a sense, the general sense of rigging, they are in general trying to take something from us, feeds off the specificity, right, of actual things that happen. Like a printer will fail, right? Someone will leave a vote on the floor, right? I mean, that's the way it goes. An institutional procedure that's working at this scale, mistakes will happen, but the mistakes become meaningful in relation to the narrative, and the narrative is fed by its ability to pick these things. And this leads to the third sense of rigging, which is that this kind of parasitic relationship between the general and the particular, right? When I see, evidence of rigging in the local instance, it feeds the general narrative. Well, this is not just true of the last few years, but true of really the last couple of 100 years. This play between the generality and the particularity of rigging in that sense allows people, in fact, to rig elections, right? To say, well, if there's something wrong with this election, we have to get in there and fix it, right? We need to get rid of these mail-in ballots. We need to make it harder for people to register. We need more signatures. So in some sense, the two parts, the general and the particular sense of rigging, actually provide an alibi for the reality of rigging, right? Where in fact, people make it harder for people to vote. And one of the things that's interesting to me about the longer history of this is that accusations, right, or panics around election rigging have followed pretty much like clockwork any significant expansion of an electorate. When electorates get bigger, when the franchise is expanded, someone will say, "Oh, rigging," right? More voters mean more of an opportunity for the election to be wrong in some sense, right? So there's this idea that the reality of rigging, right, depends on this dyadic relationship between rigging understood as a play between the particular and the general. So that altogether, those three aspects are for me the myth of rigging, right? And it's a powerful machine, and it's very effective because every time you're looking at one part of the machine, right, the other part is doing work on its own, right? So there's something very ideologically sophisticated about what can often feel like a very blunt tool, just saying, oh, this election is rigged. It's easy for us to dismiss that, but it's very powerful because of this multi-part structure. The other sense of rigging that I talk about, and this is where I try to offer a version of rigging that's an alternative to the myth of rigging, is rigging understood in the more nautical sense of rigging out a ship, of making something, of building something. And this feeling that there's a less nefarious version of understanding elections as rigged, which is simply to say, elections, like everything else that exists in history and culture, is something that we made. And because we made it, it's possible both to improve it, to poke holes in it, to criticize it, and that's not a weakness of elections. The fact that they are rigged in the way that ships are rigged out is not necessarily a bad thing. So I'm trying in some sense, and this is where the subtitle of the book, Literature, Legitimacy, and Other Rigged Systems, there's an idea there that we can, if we acknowledge the simply real and true and not necessarily bad way in which the things that we count on to organize our shared social worlds, that these are the things that we have made, and thus they will always be imperfect. That's not necessarily a bad thing. That's not a damning thing. So in some sense, I'm trying to save rigging from the riggers, which actually gets to the second question about ideas as things. One of the possibilities that emerges from thinking about elections as rigged in that less nefarious sense is the ability to look at elections as a collection of parts, a collection of practices, procedures, a collection of things. And one of the interesting qualities of the history of elections is that we have tended not to notice that they are things, or rather that they're filled with things, until they go wrong, right? When an election works well, and this is, I quote somewhere, the electoral administrator's prayer, like, let this be a landslide. A
landslide, yes.
Right? Because if it's a landslide, no one's going to look.
That's a problem,
Yeah, no one's going to look. Because every time you look, you'll find a problem, because
there are problems.
Made human
it's
things.
It's full of things.
It's full of things, and things will always create problems. So, so my interest in ideas as things is really a double one. One, I want this book to sort of defamiliarize or to historicize in advance the things of elections, so that we don't only notice them when it's a crisis. We don't only notice them at times of failure, right? But that we think in the process of voting, at those moments when we are, as Michael Polanyi would say, not attending to, but attending from the details of the elections in which we're participating, right? That instead of attending from them, looking away and just accepting them as natural because there's no problem, I want to look at things as things before there's a problem, right? And that there is for me, a therapeutic and a critical function to that, right? To appreciate, again, the made quality, the constructed quality,
the rigged
quality, and the imaginative quality of our electoral things is, in a way, it's a way to protect ourselves from the feeling of crisis and surprise. The other side of that, though, so there are the things, there are the ballots, the ballot boxes, the levers, the I voted stickers, all the things of an election. I want to acknowledge them and to think and to ask, where do they come from? What was the idea that
what are their entailments?
What are the entailments? Exactly.
Things, because all things are entailed. in other
Exactly.
things, in processes, in discourses, and so on.
Exactly. And just the other side of that is that it's a way to think about procedure as a thing, so it's both the ballot, but it's also what we do with the ballot as we move it from this part of the room to the other part of the room, right? That's a practice, it's an act, it's an event. But I want to think about procedure as something that, in one sense, falls in between an act or an idea and a thing, so that we can try to, as from the quote that you read, rethink some of what we think about as intellectual history as not divorced from the materiality of the world. Mm-hmm. Right? We don't need to choose between the imagination and matter, or the idea and the material, or the concept and the thing. Right? That feels to me like the wrong way to do this kind of history, because nothing falls easily into those categories.
I will circle back to the Alice in Wonderland, the Dodo and the caucus, because I found that section really fascinating. But on this matter of the thingness, there is a beautiful section, actually several sections, where you discuss the 1872 Ballot Act, mm-hmm. in Britain. Mm-hmm. But the part that caught my attention was what, to misquote or to echo Frank Kermode, the genesis of the secret ballot. The genesis, because it does actually have a genesis. And actually, secrecy is not necessarily tied to democracy. Could you elaborate? Because that also focuses on the thingness of the ballot box and its entailment. So if you could talk a little bit about the genesis of ballot secrecy.
Yeah. The secret ballot, I mean, I think this is one of the most sort of striking, one of the aspects of what I'm talking about that comes most alive when thought of historically. A lot of us today just assume that a ballot is secret, that you cast a ballot secretly, that it's a private thing, it's an independent thing. You can tell someone how you voted, but you don't have to, and that's an essential part of democracy, right? That the idea is that, and we would imagine that secret ballot acts came into being, and this is sometimes how they were presented early on, particularly going back to the 1830s, as a way of protecting voters from the interests and the pressure of landlords, bosses, et cetera, right? So this idea that I would be priests, exactly. So that I would be able to vote in secret would be able to allow me to protect, right, the kind of interiority that I'm expressing tacitly or silently or secretly in the vote. But one of the things that's really interesting is to trace out how the secret ballot was not always, and in fact, early on, not often understood as something that would protect the voter in that way. The secret ballot really has its start as the Australian ballot. And it was in part brought in not as a way of protecting secrecy, but as a way of, in some sense, disciplining the vote, right? And that when the Australian ballot was put together, and this is one of the first versions of the secret ballot, what was important about it was not that it was secret, but that it was written, right? And so that you would have a ballot paper and you would vote with a ballot paper. And the ballot paper was standardized, right? So you didn't have individual political parties or candidates producing different ballots, but you had a government-produced ballot that worked one way. And so, in a way, the secrecy of the ballot was a felicitous byproduct of the materiality of the ballot, the fact that it was written, right? And one of the things that's really striking about the Ballot Act is that it did, and this is something that historians like Elaine Hadley and James Vernon have written about beautifully, that elections, particularly in Britain, really changed when the Ballot Act, right, brought in the secret ballot, the written ballot, ballots which were more like carnivalesque, right, or festive occasions.
Very festive, lots of food and drink and
food, drink,
merriment.
people being carried around on chairs, like the whole bit, and also people yelling at each other, and most importantly, people who did not have the vote, right, being in a position to shout down or to try to influence those who would vote, because of course you knew how people were voting, right? So the idea was that it was a way to kind of
discipline the vote.
To discipline the vote, because that ability of people who did not have the vote to vote by expressing their opinion on these carnival days, election days, became less possible. As the history goes on, though, you know, the adoption of the secret ballot, and this is one of the things that's most striking. So when the secret ballot is argued for in the 1830s, the arguments, and George Grote is one of the major figures here, it is cast as something that's going to protect the interest of the individual, right? And from sources of power beyond. When the secret ballot comes back later, it comes back as something that's going to protect elections from voters, because it's going to make it more difficult, right, for voters, individual voters, to be bribed, right? And so the idea was that if votes were in public, you could listen in, and if you paid someone to vote a certain way, you'd know if they did it or not. If you have a secret ballot, someone could say, sure, I'll vote your way, give me the $10, and then you could vote another way, and of course, the investor would never know the difference. So the idea was that the secret ballot, and this is many of the arguments that were happening in Parliament at the time, the secret ballot was advocated often because it would allow democracy to function without voters benefiting from bribes, right? And so there's this really, and of course, the secret ballot doesn't pass when it was marketed as something that was going to protect voters. When it was marketed as something that was going to protect elections from voters, then it seemed like a fantastic idea, right? When you get into the United States context, it's even more surprising, because some of the most enthusiastic advocates of the secret ballot were election administrators in the Jim Crow South. And one of the ideas was that the secret ballot, because it was a written ballot, offered one way to authorize the use of literacy tests and to make registering to vote more difficult for Black voters. And so the secret ballot was really, and the state legislators who supported the secret ballot made no secret of the fact that the secret ballot was being used to disenfranchise newly enfranchised Black voters. So it's a very interesting, it was an interesting thing, because the secrecy of the ballot to me feels like a necessity. It feels like an ethical imperative. But looking at this history and seeing the thingness of the secret ballot shows that history is far more complicated.
Changed. Yeah, it has changed.
Yeah.
Your mention, which you also see in the book, about the secret ballot also being a protection from voters, also a protection against the undue monetary influence. It brings to mind a story that I heard recently when I went to Ghana. I come from Ghana. And this is one of the parties which shall remain unnamed. And they were voting for the candidates for the various positions, party chairman and so on. And during those campaigns, there's a lot of, attempts to bribe the delegates and so on. And this particular person who had apparently spread a lot of money to get voted in, but the ballot is secret, lost. He lost dramatically, but at the end, what was fascinating is that at the end of the ballot that he has spent a lot of money and lost, some of the delegate electors came out to say, yes, we took his money and voted against him.
You see?
They came out openly to say, yes,
it works.
We took his money and we voted against him.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Amazing.
So in fact, it's popularly said that the most scary people are electors. The people that you need to be scared of most are the electorate or electors, because they vote in secret.
Yes, exactly.
So it makes them extremely scary.
Yes.
But let me switch to take you now back to the Lewis Carroll, Alice in Wonderland, the caucus race, which was really fascinating. And also the very complex etymology that you derive for the word caucus itself. It seems to be all over the place. So take us into the politics of, or the political discourse of Alice in Wonderland.
Yes. So when I first started looking into it, I wanted simply to know what the word meant, and more to the point, what Lewis Carroll would have meant by it. So, I started looking around and just trying to figure out what someone, particularly someone with pretty generally conservative politics, would have meant by thinking about this kind of antic moment, right? The caucus race in Alice in Wonderland. Alice comes out of a pool of her own tears, and she's wet, and all these animals are also wet because she cried when she was big, and then she almost drowns in her tears when she's small. And so she gets out, and all the animals are sopping wet, and they say, well, how are we going to dry off? And the dodo bird says, well, I know what we should do. We should have a caucus race, because that's the driest thing around. Alice says, well, how do we have a caucus race? And he says, well, it's simple. Just start running. And so everyone runs around, and they just run and run and run. And then when they stop, right, Alice says, well, who has won? Because there's no rule. There's no order to it. And the dodo holds up a finger and says, everyone has won, and all must have prizes, right? At which point Alice tries to reach through her pockets to find little bits of candy to give out to all the freshly dried animals. There are two parts to this. One is the etymology, right? What does the word mean to him? And there are a lot of different senses of the word. The idea that a caucus comes from the idea of a ship's caulker, right? Someone who caulks ships. And so that it had something to do with labor history, that a caucus was associated with the Algonquin word, kakuasu, one who decides, that the word caucus was associated with the modern Greek word for kalkos, or drinking cup. The idea being that caucuses were events that people would sort of booze it up at. It's unclear where exactly the word comes from, but what is clear is that it was an American word, right? And that when, or at least this was my first sense, that when Carroll would have thought about a caucus race, he would have been opposing his idea of what an election should be like to an idea of the American, the kind of Wild West caucus. As, however, I looked more into it and started reading a number of political pamphlets, satirical political pamphlets that Lewis Carroll produced in his Oxford years, it became clear that although the term still carried its American resonance, it was really referring to ways in which different political groups were in and around Oxford, the city of Oxford, gathering in order to elect different figures to positions of power, to make different decisions about architecture, about promotion cases, tenure cases, how different decisions were being made about distribution of funds, etc. And that Carroll worried about caucusing, right, within the context of university politics. And so it's very interesting to sort of follow the whole history, the background of the word, its resonances, what it meant more broadly within the context of British politics, as British politics were both differentiating themselves and associating themselves with what was happening in the American scene. But then really particularly in terms of how Carroll was looking very closely at how decisions by groups were getting made within the city of Oxford and within Oxford University. This is especially interesting because Carroll, who was, of course, a member of the university, started causing trouble at meetings, right? A very familiar academic thing, causing trouble at meetings. And the way that he would do it is that as different decisions were getting made, he would put pressure on the rules, right? And say, well, you want to count the votes in this way. If people raise their hand or we tally them in this way, here's a problem. Here's a paradox. That here's an issue. And one of the things that he discovered as he was putting logical pressure on the different kinds of votes that were being taken on committees, he discovered, and this is something I mentioned earlier, or rediscovered, independently discovered, Condorcet's paradox, right? The idea that group decisions, the aggregation of a set of individual preference schedules, ranked choices, can produce a loop, a cycle. So that, if you have a committee deciding on, one of 4 designs for a new belfry, this is one of the issues that was really important to him, the design of the new belfry at Christ Church College. And they were A, B, C, and D. You could have a situation where, although every individual would have a clear preference, A over B, B over C, C over D, D over A, etc., when you added up the preferences, you could end up with the group preferring a cycle. The group would prefer A over B, B over C, C over D, and D over A. So you would get into this infinite loop. And that's the paradox, Condorcet's paradox. Going back to the caucus race, when the dodo holds up its finger and says, everyone has won and all must have prizes, it's actually a not even satirical, but a pretty direct description of a cycle, right? Well, if A beats B, B beats C, C beats D, and D beats A, everyone has won depending on where you start in the counting, and all must have prizes.
But also you left one detail. He drew a circle. He drew a circle and asked them to run from any which way. So there was no starting gun. They started off on different points of the circle, and they said, just run. And then they run, and then all of a sudden he says, stop. So in fact, the fact that they run in a circle and they run from different points of the circle confirms the logic of the circular ideas.
That's great. That's great.
Yeah, you describe it in the book. I'm just reminding you.
No, that's great. That's right. That's great.
So, earlier in the book, because as I mentioned earlier, you try, and this will be maybe I think we have time for a couple more questions. You try to, this is a very complex interdisciplinary text. There's a lot of political theory, election theory. It's very rich. That material is very rich. And it's also very philosophical, a lot of philosophical parts. But it is also a book of literary criticism. But at some point, you style yourself as a mythologist. You use Roland Barthes to launch yourself up as a mythologist. I thought that was very intriguing. What do you mean? Please explain a mythologist as method.
Yes. So Roland Barthes in his classic work Mythologies, defines, he's thinking about myth not in terms of ancient myth, classical myth, but as the myths that underwrite a particular social world. Right? What are the things that we all believe that allow us to move through the world and say, this is the way that it should be, right? Things are, we live in the best of all possible worlds, or at least we live in a world that I understand, and not to ask too many questions, right? And so he's really interested. This is a way for him to think about, in a sense, the structure of ideology. What is it that underwrites the world at a particular moment? And so he identifies 3 positions. There's the consumer of myths, the producer of myths, and the mythologist. The producer of myths is the person, it's like the PR guy, the political hack, the spin doctor.
The spin doctor.
Exactly. The people who are telling the stories, right, that we believe and that help to underwrite things as they are. Well, of course, this is it. Of course, this is the way things are. The consumer of myth is the person who, reading the newspaper, watching the news, watching a television show, engaging in conversation, absorbs the myth and says, yes, I agree. And one of the things that Bart is interested in, well, one, he's interested in the structure of this, right? And it goes back to what I said at the outset about the myth of rigging, right? And he's interested in how myth exploits or depends on this oscillation between what he calls meaning and form, right? Which is the content of the myth and this sort of shape of the myth, right? And that what makes it powerful is this play between these different levels, right? And it's a very complicated argument based in structural linguistics that he's drawing on there. But this sense of a play between the general and the particular is something that underwrites, right, the structural power of myth, right, in addition to whatever its particular content is. But the other part of the argument has to do, in some sense, with not just what it means to be fooled by a myth, but how myth kind of feels good. It feels good to feel like all is well with the world. It feels good to watch the news and say, you know what, that's really right. I feel good about that. That makes sense to me. Things are as they should be. The mythologist is someone who comes in and, one, reveals the structure of the myth, right? Showing how the rhetoric, the logic, the structure, the form of the myth, right, can be broken apart and laid bare. And so what I try to do with rigging, what I try to do with electoral things, what I try to do with the secret ballot, these are all efforts on my part to try to prize apart the form and the meaning, right, of the different ideas that we have about elections. And in fact, the ideals we have about elections, ideals that sometimes inspire us, but sometimes get us into trouble. Because when elections don't conform to one or another ideal, we throw up our hands and say, rigged, right? So I want to get past the ideals to the structure, right, of those myths. But the other thing has to do with that feeling of feeling good about things, right? Bart has this amazing moment where he says, you know, being the mythologist is kind of lonely because, you know, when you go to dinner and, you know, everyone is enjoying a nice glass of wine, and as the mythologist, you say, well, you know what red wine actually means? Red wine, and then you break it apart. No one's going to thank you for that, right? They're going to be like, oh, you're ruining our
You're
time.
like a traffic warden.
Exactly. So this idea of the mythologist as being someone who engages in a frankly awkward excess of attention to things, you know, as they appear to be, in the effort to show how they really are, so that you can imagine maybe how they could be. That for me, you know, am I a mythologist? I wish.
I think you're a great mythologist. You're a great.
That's the aspiration.
No, I think you're a great mythologist. The thing also is that a mythologist is also a demythologizer.
Exactly.
So they're denaturalizing and demythologizing what is taken for granted. The glass of wine example is excellent.
Yes.
So you are also a demythologist, and there's a lot of many myths that you completely and your procedure, you know, the way you go about it, because there's a lot of history. Like even the account of the 1872 ballot, that actually the secret ballot has a history, and its history was also a history of disenfranchisement and so on. So the mythologist, which I think you clearly are, is also a really, really good but to demythologize, you have to know a lot. You have to comprehend the scale of it, and then weaving lots of things together, which in your case you do through interdisciplinary, you know, cross interweaving of various discourses. Now, we'll have time for a final question. And this is something that struck me very strongly in one of the chapters, I forget, is later in the book, that political representation is a work of refined and undeniable aesthetic portraiture. It comes out of a discussion from one of the novels. I forget whether it's Trollope, but anyway, it's about a parliamentary about Parliament, about the British Parliament.
Yes.
And I think it's either a reviewer or someone in the novel making the claim that the portraiture is of undeniable aesthetic. Sorry, political representation. They're talking specifically here of parliament. Is a work of refining undeniable aesthetic portraiture. The typical versus the representative. I remember the typical versus the representative. That was a very arresting. And of course, immediately I read that, I was thinking of an image or several images from Congress, of which we are inundated. I mean, we have lots of images of Congress, and how, sometimes they are sitting in debate, but also the image of disruption, January 6th, where what they represented, the portraiture or the portrait that we got, is completely not the portrait that you would expect of a representative council of the nation. So just for you to use your own words as a prompt to think further on the question of political representation as aesthetic portraiture.
Yes. This is a great question. There are two aspects of it. So to start at the wider the wider angle, one of the things that happens on January 6th, and it's something that I talk about in different ways throughout the book, is that January 6th was an especially devastating version of that moment when elections go wrong and when the procedures are revealed. One of the things that was so striking about that moment is that for a few hours, right, the world was watching TV and wondering whether these people were going to get their hands on these wooden boxes full of largely symbolic ballots, right? So it was a moment when the thingness of these, what otherwise would be symbolic or ritualistic acts, suddenly they got brought into the world as enormously consequential things, right? And so that moment when we attended to the otherwise unremarkable or even invisible, right, facts of procedure, right, was very, very striking. And in fact, all during that the aftermath of the 2020 election, learning about these minor figures within state government, or watching feeds, as I did obsessively. I would watch these closed circuit feeds of people gathering in a room.
Or postal votes arriving like 5 days after the elections.
Exactly.
I think in Georgia, the postal votes, and they would count them like 5 or 6 days. Yeah.
And we were all watching TV, watching people, watching the mailman come with a bag of votes and thinking, well, that's news, right? I mean, like when is it news to see someone deliver the mail? Well, it was for a few days, right? Excuse me. So that, I think, is one of the important things about that moment for me, is that it represented an especially violent but also characteristic moment of unexpectedly attending to the materiality of electoral procedure as a result of a crisis or a breakdown or a failure or bad faith. So that's one part of it. The other part of it, though, goes to the question of thinking about representation as a representation of, or a process of representing. I think, it comes as no surprise to anyone that there's a relationship between political representation and aesthetic representation, right? That's a familiar connection to make. But what I'm interested in is what happens when you think about representation writ large, political representation, representational democracy, representational government, and aesthetic representation, but you bring those both down to the tactile level of the vote, of the election. Because the idea is that the election is the place where, at a kind of detailed technical level, that work of representation is occurring, right? And so to be able to not just assert that there's a relationship between political representation and aesthetic representation, but to hone in on a place where we can see the mechanism in action. And this is one of the places where, for instance, thinking not about whole elections as representations, although they are, of course, that, but thinking about the individual vote as a representation. Is an individual vote, when a person casts it, a representation of an interest? Some people say that. Is it a representation of a preference? That's another thing that people say, but a preference and an interest aren't the same thing. Is it the representation of a belief? Well, that's another thing that we say, but it's also not the same. Is it the representation of an opinion, a wish, a hope? Is it a strategic or a sophisticated ballot, which is to say, it's something that represents the opposite of what I want, right? Where I, in fact, understand that voting against my interest will contribute to the ultimate success of an election, right? Where, for instance, I vote for an especially weak candidate, right, in order to weaken a stronger one.
Tactical
right?
voting in the UK, they have lots of tactical voting, so
Exactly.
so that the Liberal Democrats will get in. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Exactly. So, one of the things that's interesting about this is that if a vote is a representation of an interest, a preference, an opinion, etc., these are all distinct theories of character. They're all distinct theories of representation. They're distinct theories of personhood, right? Am I most a person when I'm expressing an opinion, or when I'm occupying an interest, or when I'm stating a preference? Now, what tends to happen when we vote is we don't really think about the difference between these things. And elections are sometimes muddled because we haven't done the kind of conceptual work of differentiating between these different representational goals. And that's important because if you believe that a vote represents a preference, you're going to gravitate naturally towards a ranked choice election. Preferences are made to be ranked. If you believe that a vote is a representation of an opinion, it doesn't make as much sense to rank opinions, right? An opinion is a statement about a state of affairs. And so this question, this micro level technical question, what is it that the vote represents when it represents something about a person? Almost everything about the architecture of an election, which then moves out to the architecture of a specific election and the results of that election, all of this turns on what I think of as a relatively unthought moment where we assert, in a way that cuts across the distinction between politics and aesthetics, that a vote is most a vote when it represents a person as being most a person in this way, right? And so that's a place where I think, to go back to the interdisciplinarity of some of what I'm trying to do, it's hard to think about that question, like what does it mean to think of a vote as a preference versus an opinion, and what are the consequences of that choice, without thinking between political theory, philosophy, social choice theory, and, for me, aesthetic and literary theory. So I see, some of what I'm doing across these different fields as not being something that I myself could necessarily choose. Is what you have to do in order to understand how representation isn't just something that can resonate between aesthetic and political realms, but in fact exists at the level of the thing, right, as something that denies really the distinction between the different disciplinary approaches. Excellent.
Actually, it's a magnificent piece of the work of a great mythologist.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you.
You refute that label. Yeah, it's been wonderful to talk to you. I'm hoping that the book will trigger even more and more this discussion, and I think it will, because it's a book also that I think has been produced at the right time, because this is when these issues, we have to think about them. Yes. And not just in the United States of America, in different parts of the world. Where I come from, our elections coincide with the American cycle. So we too we had ours in 2020. We're having another one in 2024, exactly. So, and these questions come up all the time. There are court cases, there are disputes, sometimes they're near violent and so on. So all these questions become, and rigging is also an accusation that gets spat out in different realms.
Yes.
So it's been wonderful to talking to you, Kent. I really enjoyed our conversation.